Hi, my name is Sonya,
Hi, I'm Katia.
and today we're going to be having a dialogue about the interconnectedness of our work with prison and police abolition and how that relates to things that we've been learning this semester in our Thich Nhat Hanh class around engaged Buddhism and things like interbeing and genuine security, especially thinking about how systems like policing relate to our experiences as students on a college campus and with also within other institutions and communities that we exist in.
So to kind of start off the dialogue, I thought it would be nice to just check in with how we're feeling in general and how we're feeling about talking about these things.
Yeah, I think for me, there's always a little bit of pressure when things are being recorded about like, oh, like, is this gonna be 100% right? Or like stuff like that. But what I like about being in dialogue with you, especially because you're someone that I trust, is this ability to explore ideas and kind of work off each other as we're learning through engagement with one another. What about you?
Yeah. Um, I am feeling a little bit tired, and so I also have a similar worry about what if I'm not coming across as like eloquent or put together in my answers, but I think that is another thing that I really like about dialogue, like you said, that we get to kind of um, share this very natural process of like figuring things out together and like show some real learning that's happening in like a very natural way that might be messy sometimes, but is very valuable.
Um, we wanted to start by kind of giving an overview of the work that we've been doing in terms of our community engagement. And so I was going to talk a little bit about my work and how I've been relating the work I've been engaged in prison abolition to ideas of anti-militarism and also things like genuine security, which we'll talk about in more detail as we talk. Um, but yeah, so for me, I started work in prison abolition um, really my freshman year of college. And before that, I had been working on policing issues in my local community for a long time, since like my first year of high school.
Mhm.
And even before then, I'd been engaged in community organizing and like trying to ensure that people in my community, especially young people, because that was the position I was in, had access to voice and choice in our communities. And so as I came to college, it was the first time I ever heard of abolition before. And I found it incredibly liberating. Like this idea that we didn't have to confine our imaginations of what we wanted for our futures to the current systems that we live in. And this was really an important thing for me because I had been very deeply involved in looking at how to reform policing in my hometown. And I had done a 4-year research project at the level that we were meeting with our mayor and our police representatives and a lot of young people in our city. And what I found over and over again was that these common reforms that were being held up as, as like what could really help fix
Mhm.
policing and make policing less violent and harmful to our communities. When you actually look at the research, a lot of those things don't actually um, greatly impact like justice for our community, right, as a whole. And so I was becoming a bit jaded in terms of like what reforms could really do. And so coming to college and being told for the first time that I didn't have to like confine myself to those boxes that are set up. Like we can imagine worlds without a reliance on police and without a reliance on incarceration was hugely liberating and also really affirmed my experiences growing up because growing up I also was someone who a lot of people in my community came to for support when they weren't willing to go to like state sanctioned, I guess, resources because they knew the violence that also happens in those systems. And so and that kind of leads to like this conversation and this around things like transformative justice of like community-based solutions for harm. And so those are things that I've been practicing without those words as I was growing up, from like really the time I was in elementary school and on, both in my own family and also within my friends and even people I didn't know. And so when I learned about abolition, I like threw myself into it, and I started organizing um, a little bit on campus, but mostly working with local organizations in abolition in the LA and Riverside area. And I found it like very rewarding. And then this class has been really interesting because I've been able to connect abolition of policing and prisons to like a more global scale in terms of thinking about militarism and also specifically the US military's impact globally on lots of nations and communities across the world, including our own here in the United States. And also thinking about frameworks like engaged Buddhism and genuine security as ways to think about, like, see abolition through a lens. And so for my community engagement, I did a lot of little things around my abolition work. So things that I'm already engaged in, like the Justice Education Initiative here at the school, going to meetings around that and supporting efforts. One of the major things that I was involved in was helping support a professor here named Suchi Brahman, who was working on a project called Undanced Dances Through Prison Walls During a Pandemic, which is a really beautiful project about expressing liberation in our bodies and expressing liberation in profoundly unfree places, like within jails. And Suchi is a dance professor and a beautiful artist. And so this project really comes out of her vision and her collaboration, her longtime collaboration with people currently incarcerated. And so it was actually the first time this performance has ever been performed live. During the pandemic, they made a beautiful film that they'd been showing, but this was the first opportunity that we had to perform it live. And so I met with her and also the Prison Abolition Collective here many times to help plan and support that event happening here. And I actually helped co-facilitate it alongside her, as well as helping create resources that people who came could come away with so that they can also get engage with the movement and learn more about how to get involved in abolition.
First of all, I looked briefly over because I have one of the resources that Sonya made from the event that she helped co-facilitate, this Undanced Dances Through Prison Walls, which was amazing. And it's this little pin with like a QR code that I had on my backpack for a while, and then it like kind of bent and fell off at the airport and someone handed it back to me. So I still have it, but it's not on my backpack anymore. Yeah, I also just want to thank Sonya for having this dialogue with me, and like I guess I feel like it's such a gift to hear you speak on these things that you've been engaged in for so long. And it's really making me think about how like our our experience and like engagement with abolition and all the concepts that are connected to it and surround it are like, we're coming from very different like experience levels. And so when I came into college and I think I heard like prison abolition for the first time, I was like I had a very different reaction, I think, because I came from like a very different place where I like hadn't really been involved in that work before. And I was like, I was like, "What? Like, how would that even work?" Like, I've never heard of that before, and I thought it sounded so, like, radical and so, like, um, I don't know, something that, like, was almost scary to think about because I didn't know what the other possibilities could be, and so I feel like I've been so interested in exploring abolition more and learning more, and I'm so inspired to always hear about Sonya's community engagement and just like how she's been like involved in this work for so long. And so one of the things is I did go to the event, the Undance Dances Through Prison Walls, and I was like so touched by their performances, and it was so basically, I mean, Sonya could probably explain it better than me, but it was kind of like poetry combined with dances. And I know it was like a lot of different people's experiences, and the person reading the poem was not always the person who wrote the poem, but oftentimes they had a relation. I don't know if you want to speak more on this. You definitely know more.
Yeah, so I think you did a good job explaining it. Basically, the foundation of the project is that generally the work that Sushi does inside is helping people inside dance and also dance their stories, right? Because dancing is a form of our expression, and also um, prisons are very fundamentally taking away control from people, including autonomy over their own bodies, right? So dancing is a way to give people back power around how they're embodying themselves, right? And so during the pandemic, it was very hard because people could no longer come into the prisons, which meant that those classes, those inside out classes, couldn't continue in the same way that they had been before. And so what they did was they actually did written dances, which it may sound funny to you at first, but it actually allowed for even more amounts of imagination and liberation than before, because when you're writing dances, they can take place anywhere. You could be writing a dance in space. You could be writing a dance like in your like in your dreams, like whatever you can dream of, you can make that real when you're creating, right? And so it did even open up even more possibilities. But this performance was to these dances that people wrote inside during the pandemic, and some of the people who wrote the dances were released in that time period and were actually able to be a part of the performance with us, but some of the people who wrote them are still incarcerated, are still inside. Um, and so they were either read by someone else um, or performed by someone else. But everyone that spoke or performed has connection to the people inside, has either gone inside with Suchi, been a part of that class before, or is formerly incarcerated and has taken that class and been a part of that class as well. And so everyone involved had that connection and knows deeply what it's like to be a part of creating liberation in profoundly unfree spaces, which is really like a beautiful thing, right? Thinking about how we can create liberation everywhere, like, and how we can do that together. I find really beautiful. And something when you're talking that came up for me, Katia, was this fear of abolition, right? I think it's like a common first reaction because we're so used to the systems that are in place. And just a quote that I love is by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and it says, "Abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions." And so I think that's for me why I don't find abolition scary. I find it beautiful and hopeful. And the only thing that brings me a lot of hope is this idea that, like I said before, we don't need to confine ourselves to systems that we know cause harm. We can imagine and build and co-create systems that heal and repair and bring people in and give people the resources that they need to thrive and survive. And I think that is what gives me hope. And it brings me back to this idea of genuine security that we talked about in the class. And that's why I think for me, like abolition and genuine security are so closely linked in my mind. And just for context for people, the definition of genuine security, as defined by genuinesecurity.org, is valuing people and having confidence in their potential to live in life-affirming ways, building a strong personal core that enables us to work with others across lines of significant difference through honest and open dialogue. Yeah. So I think that's like where I see like a beautiful connecting point as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, well, I'm thinking about a lot of things now. The quote that you shared, that abolition is about presence and not absence, is something that I'm I'm rolling around in my mind. And I feel like at once I both connected with that, like, oh yeah, like that feels true. And then I'm also questioning what that means. And I'm wondering if you have more thoughts on that. Um, is it like presence in terms of being of like awareness of more, because I guess what made me hesitant about the idea of abolition when I first came to college, and I had never heard it before, and I didn't know, I guess, the histories of like prisons and policing, and all of its connections to anti-Black racism specifically. And I didn't know any of those things before coming to college. I think I wasn't I also wasn't able to recognize the common humanity, and like also the like recognize how much, I guess this is this idea of what Thich Nhat Hanh was saying, that um it's not like the individual necessarily, but like suffering as an expression of like, I guess, a suffering system, or like a system that produces more suffering. I'm not saying that like very clearly. um but that I think I started like putting more of those pieces together, and I'm trying to like tie it back to this presence and absence quote. And so I'm wondering if you have more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love what you brought up about Thich Nhat Hanh, and I'll also talk about um, how I view like this idea of presence and fullness and abundance. But when you were talking about Thich Nhat Hanh, it brought up for me this other quote from one of his interviews called "Beyond the Environment: Fall Back in Love with Mother Nature" from 2012.
Mhm.
And this quote is very similar to what you just said. It says, "We have learned the lesson that when we perpetuate violence towards our own and other species, we are violent towards ourselves. And when we know how to protect all beings, we are protecting ourselves."
Mm.
And so this really connects to his ideas of interbeing that underlie all of what we learned this semester. And I also think that this is deeply connected to the way that why I see um, prisons as such unjust institutions. And to go back to what we're talking about in terms of presence, this really is thinking about like what can exist when we stop investing in systems that we know contribute to harm in our communities. And this isn't just and like based on personal experience, because I have seen like the personal experience of like how detrimental incarceration is and policing is to our communities in the terms of like separating people from their support systems when they might need them the most. And also like in many ways, policing and prisons are intensely violent, and also do not do things like reduce crime meaningfully if you actually look at statistics, and do not meaningfully protect our communities. And something that I think is really interesting is that we actually already have case studies of communities in our nation that are not heavily policed and are known as the safest communities, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And those are the communities where we invest in public infrastructure, right? We invest in education and housing and having access to things like healthcare, and all of these things meaningfully contribute to reducing things like harm in our communities because people's needs are met. And so for me, it's not a wild stretch to think about what this could look like. Um, um, but the problem is that access to those communities, right, that have where people who live in them have access to these resources in this nation is based on wealth. And,
Mhm.
and so much of our wealth in this country is based historically on race because of the way that this country has been shaped and how wealth accumulation has happened, right? So we fall into this pattern, um, where communities are under resourced and over policed, and where policing does not make those communities safer, but rather actually contributes to higher levels of poverty and cycles of violence and incarceration because people are constantly being targeted by the state. And a lot of policing and incarceration also targets people who do not have the resources to sidestep those systems, like by having adequate representation under the law.
Yeah.
Or for example, there's lots of laws that have been created to police things like not having enough money in the first place, which then contributes to cycles where your family or loved ones are trying to make your bail. Something that I learned have been researching is actually the difference between jails and prisons, right? Because we often use those words interchangeably, but in reality, jails tend to be shorter term, and often hold people who are actually unsentenced, meaning have not been technically found guilty by the law under the court system, which is supposed to give like the quote is innocence until proven guilty, and yet people are held in jails who have not been proven guilty, which is its own issue. but um but are held there often because they cannot afford to pay the fines or the bail to get out of jail. Whereas people who can afford to meet those things do not have to suffer the same things under the carceral system. And when people are incarcerated, if we're thinking about systems like families where you have that could be an income that is now taken out. If you're incarcerated, you not only will probably lose your job because you're not able to attend work, but you'll also, when you're get out of incarceration, will probably have a harder time finding secure work, which leads to these cycles, right, where people are not becoming safer or more secure in our communities, but are actually being cast further and further out, in which they have less and less access to support systems to help them get back on their feet. And so to me, that this idea of presence is this idea of how are we as a community committing to holding each other in our times of need. And for me, that looks like social systems that are there to help people be able to deal with the harm that they've caused and also support the people who've been harmed by those actions, and thinking about how can we collectively address these issues meaningfully in a way that brings people closer together, makes our community stronger, and helps support people in being able to benefit, like positively contribute to our communities as a whole. And to me, that does not look like inflicting further violence on people who have supposedly committed violence, because we know that violence leads to more violence. We know that the only thing that actively prevents violence is healing and giving people the resources that they need
Mm.
to meet the basic needs that aren't being met that result in those things happening in the first place. And a lot of people will like claim that abolitionists are naive and like are imagining like this perfect world where no conflict happens and no harm happens. But in reality, um, abolitionists and people who are really engaged in the work, especially people who are engaged in things like transformative justice as well, are very aware of the harms that are caused. And instead of doing things like separation, it's a commitment to trying to connect, right? And so to try to support people in those times, and also a commitment to the people who've been harmed. Because the current way the prison industrial complex works does not center the harm, like the person who's been harmed at all, and often actually centers the state instead of them. And there's also very little resources for people who've been harmed post that harm happening. And so we're talking about things like increased access to mental health care, increased access to healthcare, increased access to stable work with good conditions, increased access to affordable and safe housing, access to food, access to water, access to supportive networks that can help in times of need, and not in a way that doesn't cause harm, but is healing harm. So that can be access to things like restorative justice systems or transformative justice groups, access to organizations that are actively working towards equity and creating these kind of just systems. All of those things to me are things that are present in an abolitionist future.
Mm. Wow, that was a lot. I had um, so many thoughts come up as you were talking through that. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. I feel like, yeah, presence can be so many things, and like it can also be as simply as like the whole idea of prisons, like having that separation of just taking someone out of the community and like not seeing them anymore. Um, just the presence of everyone in the community and the absence of no one, like no one gets just put away or separated. Um, so it could mean like the presence of all of us, but also I guess the presence of all that could be possible, all the possibilities. So wow, yeah, thank you. I don't know. I think I'm mostly I have a lot to learn still, I think. And I think a lot of what abolition stands for really resonates with me because it's about creating these sustainable communities and understanding that people who are maybe like um, inflicting harm or creating violence, like that isn't coming from nowhere. It's usually coming from some other form of violence that that person has been exposed to. And like, I guess the rippling like waves of suffering kind of leads to more suffering. And I really like how you said that healing is the only, I guess, I'm not sure how you use it, the only like active way to not have more suffering and violence. Um, and I was actually wondering if you would like to switch gears a little bit and in terms of talking about creating like a sustainable, caring community, talk about kind of the conversation we had around uh, policing on campus and I guess a res life role a little bit. I specifically wanted to have this dialogue with Sonya, not only because I like am so inspired by the work she does and like so respect like everything that she stands for, but because we also had this very kind of like key pivotal conversation that helped me like shift out of a like damaging mindset that I had at the beginning of the year around, I think I was just very in my emotions, and I am still learning how to think outside of the box in terms of not just thinking about what solutions an institution offers in terms of like consequences for something or like accountability for something, but thinking like imagining more of the possibilities um, in specifically creating this community that's motivated by care and to have the presence of everyone. Um, and so I guess specifically our conversation had to do with our supervisors as a part of the Res Life staff were kind of asking us to monitor or police the students more closely in terms of wearing masks and in the halls and in the dorms. And a lot of us were uncomfortable with it as like students ourselves too. And the whole reason most of us took this position with Res Life was because we care so much about creating um, a community of care and having people come to us in the halls and trust us and like building relationships. And so to have this dynamic of trying to build like a welcoming and caring community, but also having a role of like I guess surveillance and like looking like reporting on other students just didn't mesh well and didn't make sense. And I think we had like a lot of conflicting and frustrating feelings. But at a certain point, I think I was very confused and like frustrated, and I felt at the time at the beginning of the year, for a portion of the time I was like very frustrated with people who were not wearing masks in the halls. And I was like, oh, they don't care about our community, and that's why they're not wearing masks in the halls. And that, I mean, obviously that isn't true for everyone, but I was like, how do I, like, it's frustrating that they don't seem to care. But also how do I make everyone wear masks and like um and so I had this conversation with Sonya and with Chris, who's another member in our class and another great friend, which really helped kind of bring back perspective of like, first of all, you can't make everyone wear masks, and like you shouldn't force anyone to do anything. But also just like the systems that the school had in place for, I guess, forcing people to wear masks was kind of like scare tactics of you'll which was really extreme too, which was that if you kind of get if they get reports that a certain student wasn't wearing their masks for an undefined number of times, they've kept it very vague that this student might lose their housing. And that's so huge. And that was the only thing. There was no like, oh, you get a warning or anything. It's just like you'll lose your housing. And not a lot of people pushed back against that, to be honest. And that was kind of the only thing that was there. And so I was like, maybe, like, does that have to happen? Like, maybe that has to happen if like a certain student, every time I see them in the halls, they're never wearing their mask. Like maybe they need to be removed from the rest of the community so that like we don't have COVID. But that was the only option that I had heard. And I think I was just so frustrated at the time and so kind of like, I guess, isolated from other students also because we weren't able to like gather together that much because of COVID to like talk about these things. That I really I really found a lot of clarity through the conversation with Sonya and Chris.
I remember the big thing to me was like the fact that Res Life was saying that they would take away housing from students. And I remember my reaction to that was that was much too extreme. And that I think my reaction was like, oh, I would not tell anyone then if that happened. And I remember that we had a conversation about that, about like what it means to take away a student's housing. Um, like considering the conditions that like different people are in different situations, right, at college. Like for some people you could take away their housing and they could afford to get their own housing, or they could afford to like figure something else out. But there's a lot of students on campus that if you took away their housing they could no longer attend school, if they don't have family nearby, if they don't have the financial means to be able to afford outside housing. Not to mention that for a lot of students on campus, getting aid in terms of housing, like maybe the only reason that they can afford to be here is because of the money that the school gives them for housing. So for me, this idea of taking away people's like safe, like access to safe and secure housing was a really, really big deal. And it was something that did not make sense to me. So I remember that was I think one of the things that like really pushed me to like to open a conversation with you about like reconsidering um, both that policy as someone who has influence over that as part of residential life, but also like as an individual actor as well, in terms of like how we were talking, or like how I was hearing you express like complying to that guidance as well. And I remember I was a bit hesitant to have the conversation too, because I knew that you were in, like you said, you were very upset by what was going on. And I knew, because I know you, I knew that it wasn't coming out of a place of like, oh, I don't want them to have housing, or a place of negativity at all, but rather a place of like you had negative experiences trying to like talk to people about their masks, and I knew it came out of a place of wanting to protect community. So I did want to be really careful in that conversation as well, not to like undervalue your experiences, and like your role as well.
We talked about that, and we talked about like emotion regulation, and we talked about um I think the main thing for me was I was like, okay, well, we came to the point where I was like, what do I do? Like, um, well, what do I do to protect the community, I guess, and make sure that everyone is safe, because I really felt like most of my frustration, it was coming out of like I need to protect the community. I'm here to make sure that everyone is safe and they feel safe. And I have students coming up saying they don't feel safe because they see people not wearing masks in the halls. And so what do I do? What does accountability look like if it doesn't look like the one thing that the institution has given us? And I think that was the moment where you were like, well, you know, communities can really be like motivated by care instead of by fear tactics. And so you just have to think of ways that you can promote a caring community and let students be led by that care to I guess transform the way that the community is functioning and we're all taking care of each other. And I was like, oh duh, like that makes so much sense. And then I started thinking about, I basically changed my whole approach, and I was like, okay, i'm I'm really solidly against this policy. I don't want anyone to lose housing. Like, the way I'm going to go about this is I'm going to try to talk with these students who I see not wearing masks and care about them as part of the community too, because I think that was also a big reason uh, I guess like a moment of disconnect. I wasn't seeing the presence and like absence. I was going back to that quote, I wasn't thinking about the presence of everyone. Like when we talk about like protecting our communities, like everyone in the community is a part of the community, even the person who you may perceive as like causing harm. And so I think I was not seeing that at the beginning. I was separating the people who I perceived to be like potentially causing harm from being part of the community that I should be taking care of. And I think in that moment I realized like I absolutely cannot do that, and like I don't want to do that, and like why was I even thinking this in the first place? And so it like kind of prompted me to like make this script of how I would address it with people, and just talk about it and talk with the rest of the Res Life group chat about it. But yeah, I wanted to bring that up because I think all the emotions that rose up and all the ways that I was ready to like almost report a student, and like which in a way that really goes against all of my values, coming from like a place of kind of good intentions, but I think like just really, I guess, blinded by my emotions and not being able to like be aware of this whole going back to like the presence of everyone, and like everyone is part of the community and you have to take care of everyone and like be motivated by care. I think it was so essential for me to be able to talk to people, talk to you about it, and like take a step back and really reevaluate and see that this is not in alignment with my values. Um, and so, yeah, I just really wanted to thank you for that. And I think this kind of like process that I feel like very ashamed about, that I even like thought about that for a split second, is like very important for me to talk about, because it's like part of this whole broader process of like starting to learn about these ideas, and like I guess make like how easy it can also be to like say, oh, these aren't my values, or like these are my values, but then to start like slipping into something that's like just in alignment with the institution and like what's easily already there and just told to you. And how easy it is to not take a pause and to not think outside the box, and like what would have happened if I didn't have such a great, knowledgeable friend who was willing to have this difficult conversation with me. So yeah, I wanted to bring that up, and thank you so much.
Yeah, and for the record, I just want to say, Katia, that like I've told you this before, but for the record, you know, um, like I also mentor students on campus, or like I also like help create community on campus in different ways than Katia, but um all of the people who I know that live in Katia's hall like constantly tell me how you're like the best CC community coordinator, and that they know how much you care about them, and you go out of your way to like express that care and help create community for all the people living in your res hall. So I also know that like I just want to say how proud and moved I am that like from this conversation that we had, that it was both meaningful for you, but also that you actively went and were dedicated to practicing living the values that you embody in your everyday life and in the position that you have and with the power that you have. And I think that's so beautiful and so amazing because of the way that your actions and also your perspective have been able to shape Res Life this year, because I know that you have been actively doing that through your community engagement and through things that we probably won't touch on today as well. But I just want to like let you know that I see that, and that I think that's deeply beautiful. This is really lucky to have you as a person, but also as a person in our Res Life. And I just want to also like, while you're talking, I was resonating a lot in terms of I feel like this moment of like turning that we just talked about mirrors like the moment that I brought up before around like when I first like came to college and heard that abolition was an option, right? Where before that, it wasn't that I was supportive of what was going on, but I was kind of at this sticking point of like, I couldn't imagine beyond what had been offered to me, even though I wanted to. Like I knew that what was being offered to me wasn't the right answer, wasn't enough, but I wasn't able to like have that open up until I was told that like you don't have to operate within this system. And so for me, that's what I see happen for you, or like that's what it resonated as, was this our conversation was like just offering you the possibility to imagine beyond what the like higher ups in res life had told you was the only option, and gave you the opportunity to start imagining beyond that. And so I think that process is really beautiful, and I also want to thank you for being vulnerable enough to share that process with us as well, because you mentioned that it's not something like that you're like proud that happened, but I'm proud that it happened, you know, that you had that shift and are able to talk about it now. And just one other thing that came up for me when you're talking was this idea of when you're talking about who is our community, right? It made me think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea of beloved community, which is this idea that I come back to again and again in my work of like, what does our community mean? And in MLK's beloved community, that means everyone. It means it means everyone, whether they've caused you harm or not, whether they're really hard to get along with or not. Everyone is in that beloved community, and we're talking about on the most intense levels of like harm as well, because when we really take a hard look at what our communities are, it's not just the people that make us feel safe and valued. Our communities are complex, they're messy, there's conflict in them, there's hardship in them. But this concept of beloved community for me is a constant challenge to think about how can we draw our circles wider and wider when we're thinking about how to create change, how to create our ideal community. How do we make sure that everyone falls within that, like truly everyone? And I think that's super opposite to like these ideas of policing and incarceration, because these are ways that people are attempting to weed people out of our communities, and which actually really causes a lot of harm when we're thinking about things like interbeing and our interconnectedness. That division is really harmful for not only the people who are being removed, but for our community as a whole. On the family level, on the organizational level, just on the entire community level as a whole. When people are taken out of our communities, that's a gaping hole that they leave, right? And that's why I think you could also argue that prisons and policing are forms of creating absence, rather than presence, which I think was beautiful that you touched on before about the different ways that we can think of presence, not only as institutions, but also as our community members, and as like showing up for each other, and what it means to like, what does it mean to be present for another person, or for our community, or for our world, right? Thinking of interbeing as even beyond like a human level, but like our connection with our planet and with all beings and all matter on our planet as well.
Yeah. And I feel like I love how you connected our kind of shit like pivotal moments. And I felt so much tension in my body as I was sharing that story, because I really is not something that I'm proud of like having even felt, even though I didn't really act on it. I just kind of vented about it. I was like, in reflection, I was like, why did I even feel that? But I feel a lot more relaxed now that I shared that. And also, I kind of wanted to bring it back to, I know we already covered the definition of genuine security, but just like bringing it back again is valuing people and having confidence in their potential to live in life affirming ways, and building a strong personal core that enables us to work with others across line of significant difference through honest and open dialogue. And I wanted to bring that back because I also realized that the assumption I was having before about maybe certain members of our dorm community not caring about our community was not the truth. It was just an assumption. And when I did have that conversation with one of the people who was not wearing a mask, like immediately she was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Like I didn't realize." And like she immediately put on a mask, and ever since, like every time I've seen her, she's been wearing a mask. And like it's not like in a, oh no, I'm just putting it on because I'm scared. Like we wave at each other and we're like friendly with each other. Um, and I tried to be really intentional about approaching it in like a gentle reminder way. And I think that helped. But I think what's really sticking out for me with this definition of genuine security is like having confidence in everyone's potential to live in life affirming ways. So, like, even those community members we may feel like, who we may have assumptions about or perceive as damaging our communities, like, we have to view that they all have the potential and to like nurture that potential, I guess. So I thought that was maybe a good way to bring it back. But yeah.
Yeah, and you're just affirming for me more and more that like so much of this is intuitive to you. When you're talking, I was reflecting on the 7 core assumptions of restorative justice, which is another thing I come back again and again to in my work. And one of the core assumptions, right, to do this work is the belief that the true self in everyone is good, wise, and powerful, which is the first core assumption. And this assumption is really important in terms of how we think about others and how we realize that the way that we think others are or make assumptions about others can drastically change our interactions with them and our outcomes in terms of conflicts. And so when we truly at our core believe that everyone is good, wise, and powerful at their core, we approach situations very differently. And I think it's also a testament to your ability to like approach that situation, that you're able to create a relationship that was, again, bringing them closer rather than pushing them away, in the way that you reacted and brought up your concern about how we can make our community best for everyone, right? So I think, again, this is just like affirming that you're living all these things. And thank you for sharing that with me. I really appreciate it.
I mean, I couldn't have done this without you. I feel like that makes me feel so relieved that you think that, because before I was thinking, oh, like I'm just not, I know I'm not like at the quite the level you are with um engaging with transformative justice and abolition work. You are so knowledgeable, and I just feel like, yeah, this dialogue has truly been a gift. So I don't know. Are there things that are still on your heart or your mind that you want to talk more about?
I just really appreciated having this opportunity to talk about this with you. I'm definitely still learning so much. There's so much to learn, and so much to do in this work. But I think, and I don't think that there's levels. I don't think like I'm at a level and you're at a different level. I think the real measure to me of if someone of like someone's dedication to this work is their commitment to living it in their everyday lives. And I think that this conversation has just reaffirmed for me that that's something that you're dedicated to. And I think that that is beautiful, and that's something that I hold myself to in my everyday life. And I think that's what it means to be an abolitionist. Like, being an abolitionist is not about being able to spit off facts about why we need to abolish the prison industrial complex. Being an abolitionist is about living a future in which you are actively trying to create spaces of safety and genuine security in your everyday life where you can impact change. We all have the capacity to impact change and transform the spaces and relationships and worlds around us in even our smallest interactions, right? So to me, that is the true mark of someone who's dedicated to this practice and to this work. And it's about creating those spaces of profound presence, right? And being with each other for that. And I think that is where I see the true work. I mean, there's so much work, obviously. But I think that the best place to start is where we are. And we all have ways to unlearn carcerality in our brains, in the way we think, in the way we act towards others. And I think that what this class and this period together has offered is ways we can do that through engaged Buddhism, through mindfulness, through things like deep listening, deep understanding, through truly seeing each other and understanding the ways we're interconnected, through understanding like things like how can we actively strive to create genuine security for each other. And all of these things help us get to a future where we truly we don't need them now, but where we all have access to the resources that we need and that don't rely on the systems of the military, the police, or prisons and jails, and instead rely on each other.
This feels like a lot of points coming together. I really like how you defined what an abolitionist is and how you said there are no levels, even though sometimes I feel like there are levels. And I feel like our dialogue is also a practice of maybe a practice of abolition in a way, or of just at least exercising this muscle of being able to kind of like seen and heard, and kind of like the 5 mindfulness practices mentioned, that loving speech and deep listening, of really hearing the other person, and maybe like integrating this value of, while you're engaging in this dialogue, really thinking that the other person is good, wise, and powerful. Like you see that when you're engaging with the other person in dialogue. I think I really was feeling that here, and I think that's such a powerful tool. And so goes back to meta. We are like having this now to like practice it for later, and also just practice being in this state of mind where we can have more difficult conversations, or conversations that don't always feel like, sometimes I'll feel tense sharing something, but no, it's like what I need to do. And yeah, just believing so much in the other person, and that you can learn from them, and like you can both care about each other.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to like before, when we were talking about the initial conversation we were reflecting on, right, around like this kind of turning moment that you're talking about. I mentioned that I wasn't entirely sure if I should like bring up what I was thinking at that time. But I think it comes back to this like trusting your core self, and that you could trust my intentions as well, as coming from a place of like believing in you, and wanting like also wanting to like help you live by the values that I know you uphold. And like this idea of what can be accomplished when we have trust in each other, like that.
Mhm.
It also speaks to our relationship. And I think we've been able to have several conversations like this. Like I also remember a conversation around militarism, which was also a difficult conversation, but that I believe we both learned from, I hope. But like, I think it speaks to the way that we practice listening and seeing each other while also trusting that even when we disagree or are not at the same place at that time, that we can trust that the other person is coming from a place of good intention, coming from their internal goodness, wiseness, and powerfulness, and wanting to share that with each other in a way that we both can grow. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.
Bye.